You didn't hesitate when you drove the blade through your brother's heart. You only hesitated after, to remember the look on his face. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where the stories are soft and the deaths are anything but. If this slow descent into historical betrayal helps you drift off, like and subscribe, and thank you for helping this cursed little corner grow. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time does the murder usually begin in your mind? Tonight, you kill your twin. Not in battle, not in rage, but in something worse. A quiet, righteous certainty that your name should be carved into the city walls. Close your eyes. Feel the stillness settle, your breath slow against the hush of warm sheets, the firelight flickering behind your eyelids. You are not here, not really. You're sinking, drawn backward, past the edges of sleep and into something much older. Smell the sharpness of olive wood burning. Hear the low murmur of priests reading signs in birds. Taste dust on your tongue and milk on your lips. Wolf milk if the legends are kind. You are a child again, but not an innocent one. You were raised in the wilderness, but destiny always knew your name. You've come to build a city or a grave, one stone at a time. Once upon a time, in the ancient Italian city of Alba Longa, there lived a princess named Rhea Silvia. Now, Rhea had what you might call a complicated family situation. Her father, King Numitor, had been rather rudely overthrown by his own brother Romulus, because nothing says family values like a good old-fashioned royal coup. Romulus, being the sort of uncle who brings chaos instead of birthday presents, decided to secure his stolen throne by making Rhea Silvia a Vestal Virgin. For those keeping track at home, Vestal Virgins were priestesses sworn to 30 years of celibacy in service to the goddess Vesta. Break that vow, and you'd be buried alive. Lovely job security, really. But here's where our story takes a delightfully mythological turn, because apparently even divine beings have trouble reading the fine print on celibacy contracts. Mars, the god of war himself, decided that Rhea Silvia was exactly the sort of woman who needed some divine attention, and before you could say workplace harassment complaint, our princess found herself pregnant with twins. Now you might think that being impregnated by a literal god would provide some legal protection. You'd be wrong. When Romulus discovered that his niece was expecting, he was about as understanding as you'd expect from a man who'd already murdered his way to the throne. The twins, he declared, would have to die the moment they were born, because obviously the best way to prevent a prophecy about your downfall is to create the exact conditions that would make someone want to fulfill it. When the babies arrived, two healthy, presumably divine little boys, Romulus ordered his servants to take them to the Tiber River and drown them. Simple, efficient, and completely foolproof. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. The servants, who were apparently either soft-hearted or spectacularly incompetent at baby murder, decided on a compromise. Instead of drowning the infants outright, they placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the river. Like a twisted version of Moses, but with twice the divine parentage and significantly more wolves in the forecast. The Tiber, however, was having one of those days. Recent floods had left the river swollen and unpredictable, and rather than carrying the babies out to sea where they could conveniently disappear, the water deposited them at the base of the Palatine Hill, right in the middle of what would one day become Rome. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a gladius. And this is where our story veers from merely improbable into the realm of sure, why not? Because the crying babies didn't attract a passing merchant or a kindly peasant woman. No, they attracted a she-wolf. A literal, honest-Mars she-wolf who had recently lost her own cubs and was apparently experiencing some serious empty nest syndrome. Now you might expect a wild predator to see two helpless human babies as an easy meal, but this particular wolf, who may or may not have been sent by Mars himself, took one look at the infants and thought, you know what, I'm going to adopt these. And so she did, nursing them with her own milk and protecting them from the various dangers of the Roman wilderness. Because nothing says future world conquerors like being breastfed by a carnivore. The boys thrived under their unconventional mother's care, growing strong and wild in the caves beneath the Palatine Hill. They learned to hunt, to fight, and presumably to howl at the moon, skills that would serve them well in their future careers as world builders and fratricidal maniacs. But fate wasn't quite done with its twisted sense of humour. One day, a shepherd named Faustulus was tending his flock when he stumbled upon the most unusual family unit in ancient history, a she-wolf nursing 2 human babies. Now, most people would have run screaming in the opposite direction, but Faustulus, who was either remarkably brave or remarkably dense, decided this was perfectly normal and offered to take the boys home to his wife. The wolf, apparently satisfied with her job performance, agreed to the arrangement. And so Romulus and Remus transitioned from wolf cave to shepherd's hut, from wild beasts to, well, slightly domesticated wild beasts. Faustulus and his wife, Acca Laurentia, raised the boys as their own, teaching them the finer points of civilization, while trying to ignore the fact that they occasionally howled in their sleep and had an unsettling habit of staring at sheep with predatory intensity. The twins grew up strong, clever, and completely ungovernable. They had the kind of charisma that attracted followers and the kind of temper that made those followers nervous. They were natural leaders, born fighters, and absolutely, completely convinced of their own divine destiny. In other words, they were exactly the sort of people you'd expect to either found an empire or burn one down. By the time they reached adulthood, Romulus and Remus had become the unofficial leaders of every young troublemaker in the region. They organized raids against bandits, settled disputes through trial by combat, and generally turned the peaceful countryside into their personal adventure playground. They were beloved by the poor, feared by the wicked, and regarded with deep suspicion by anyone with property to lose. But they still had no idea who they really were. As far as they knew, they were just the unusually athletic sons of a shepherd who happened to have been raised by wolves. The whole grandsons of the rightful king thing was still a mystery, and Amulius, the man who'd tried to have them killed, was still sitting on his stolen throne, completely unaware that his greatest nightmare was currently running around the countryside, settling arguments with violence and inspiring dangerous levels of loyalty among the local youth. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the ancient world. But first, there would be kidnapping, rescue missions, and the kind of family reunion that ends with someone getting stabbed in the face. Because in ancient Rome, even happy endings came with a body count. As our wolf-raged heroes entered their 20s, they had developed what you might generously call leadership skills, and what their enemies less generously called an alarming tendency toward organized violence. Romulus and Remus had gathered around them a band of young men who shared their enthusiasm for justice, adventure, and hitting things with sticks until problems went away. They'd become the ancient equivalent of a startup, disruptive, innovative, and completely unconcerned with existing power structures. Their business model was simple: find bad guys, beat them up, redistribute their wealth, and somehow make it look heroic. It was Robin Hood meets Fight Club, with a dash of divine ancestry thrown in for good measure. The twins had made quite a name for themselves in the region around Alba Longa. They were the sort of people you called when bandits were threatening your village, when corrupt officials were demanding bribes, or when you needed someone to resolve a dispute through the ancient art of whoever still conscious at the end wins. Their reputation for fairness was matched only by their reputation for extreme violence, which, in ancient Italy, was basically a recommendation letter. But success, as any entrepreneur will tell you, comes with its own set of problems. The more famous the twins became, the more they attracted the attention of people who preferred their local heroes to be less effective. And nobody was more concerned about their rise than King Amulius himself. Amulius had been watching the twins' career with the kind of interest that keeps you awake at night. 2 young men of unknown parentage, displaying signs of divine favour, gathering armed followers, and generally behaving like the sort of people who might have opinions about illegitimate kings. That was the kind of coincidence that made paranoid tyrants reach for their assassination budget. But Amulius was a careful man. He'd learned that direct confrontation with popular heroes tends to create martyrs, and martyrs have an annoying habit of inspiring revolutions. Instead, he decided to be clever about it. He would use the twins' own sense of justice against them. The opportunity came when some of Amulius's men reported that cattle had been stolen from the royal herds. The theft had actually been committed by a rival group of bandits, but Amulius saw a chance to frame the twins for the crime. He sent his men to accuse Romulus and Remus of the theft. knowing that their pride would never allow them to back down from a fight. The plan worked perfectly. Sort of. The twins, predictably, refused to be arrested for a crime they hadn't committed, but in the ensuing battle, something went wrong. While Romulus was busy turning royal guards into modern art installations, Remus was captured and dragged away to Alba Longa to face the king's justice. Now Romulus was many things: violent, impulsive, divinely stubborn, but he was not the sort of person who abandoned family. The moment he realized his brother had been taken, he began planning a rescue mission that would make Ocean's 11 look like a church picnic. But here's where fate decided to play another one of its little jokes. Because the person Romulus chose to interrogate Remus was none other than Numitor, the twins' grandfather, though none of them knew it yet. Numitor, who had been forced to serve his usurping brother as a sort of royal advisor, found himself face to face with a young man who looked remarkably familiar. There was something about Remus's face, his bearing, his complete lack of fear in the presence of royal authority, that reminded Numitor of someone he'd lost long ago. As he questioned the prisoner, pieces began to fall into place. The age was right. The attitude was definitely right. And there were those strange stories about the boys being raised by wolves. Meanwhile, Romulus was gathering every friend, ally, and person who owed him a favor for the most audacious jailbreak in ancient history. He turned the rescue mission into a full-scale military operation, complete with siege weapons and a tactical plan that would have impressed Caesar himself. The boy who'd been raised by wolves had learned to think like a general. The attack on Alba Longa was swift, brutal, and completely unnecessary, because just as Romulus was preparing to storm the city walls, Numitor was having the most important conversation of his life with his captive grandson. The old king had put together the pieces of the puzzle: the wolf story, the timing of their birth, the divine parentage, and realized that the two young men everyone was talking about were his daughter's sons, the grandsons he'd thought were dead for 20 years. The reunion was touching, emotional, and immediately interrupted by the sound of Romulus's army attacking the city. Nothing says family bonding like your other grandson showing up with a small army to rescue his brother from you. But Numitor was quick to adapt. He sent word to Romulus that he was family, not enemy, and that perhaps they could discuss this whole situation without quite so much property damage. The message was simple: stop breaking my city, we need to talk. And so, in a scene that would have made Shakespeare weep with joy, the twins were finally reunited with their grandfather, and learned the truth about their heritage. They weren't just the wolf-raised sons of a shepherd, they were princes of Alba Longa, grandsons of the rightful king, and the nephews of the man who tried to have them killed as infants. It was the kind of revelation that changes everything. Suddenly, their entire lives made sense. The divine parentage, the wolf mother, the natural leadership skills, it all fit together like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. They weren't just random troublemakers who happened to be good at violence. They were the rightful heirs to a stolen throne, raised by the gods themselves to reclaim their birthright. Romulus, meanwhile, was having the worst day of his very long and very cruel life. Not only had his plan to eliminate the twins backfired spectacularly, but he'd also managed to reunite them with the one person in the kingdom who could legitimize their claim to power. It was like trying to swat a fly and accidentally hitting a hornet's nest with a stick. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. Romulus had spent decades ruling through fear and violence, but he'd never faced opponents who were better at both than he was. The twins, backed by their followers and legitimized by their grandfather, swept through the royal palace like a divine hurricane. Romulus's reign ended the same way it had begun, with sudden, overwhelming violence. But this time, justice was on the side of the winners. Numitor was restored to his rightful throne, the usurper was dead, and the twins had gone from wolf-raised outlaws to royal princes in the span of a single day. It was exactly the sort of dramatic reversal that made for great stories around campfires. The only problem was that Romulus and Remus had spent their entire lives being their own masters. They'd never had to share power, never had to compromise, never had to consider what someone else might want. They'd been raised by wolves, trained by violence, and shaped by the absolute certainty that they were destined for greatness. And now there were two of them, with equal claims to destiny and completely different ideas about what that destiny should look like. The seeds of conflict had been planted. All they needed was the right opportunity to grow. Having successfully overthrown a tyrant and restored their grandfather to power, Romulus and Remus found themselves in the enviable position of being young, wealthy, divinely favoured, and completely uncertain about what to do next. They were heroes without a quest, warriors without a war, and princes without a kingdom of their own. The solution, when it came to them, was so obvious that it was almost insulting they hadn't thought of it earlier. They would found a city. Not just any city, but a great city. A city that would stand for centuries and serve as a monument to their divine heritage and their spectacular rise from Wolf Cave to Royal Palace. It was the kind of project that would have made their father Mars proud, assuming he was paying attention, which, given the general reliability of Roman gods, was always a bit of a gamble. The twins gathered their followers and announced their intention to establish a new settlement. The response was enthusiastic, because nothing attracts ambitious young men like the promise of getting in on the ground floor of a future empire. They would build something unprecedented, something that would make Alba Longa look like a sleepy village by comparison. There was just one tiny problem. Actually, there were several problems, but they all stemmed from the same source. Romulus and Remus both wanted to be in charge. This shouldn't have been surprising. These were two men who had been raised by wolves, trained by violence, and convinced by every experience of their lives that they were destined for greatness. They'd never had to share ultimate authority with anyone, and they weren't about to start now. The first disagreement came when they began scouting locations for their new city. The area around the 7 hills near the Tiber River was perfect for their purposes, defensible, fertile, and conveniently located for trade. But there were multiple hills to choose from, and naturally the twins couldn't agree on which one. Romulus favoured the Palatine Hill. It was where they'd been found as babies, where the she-wolf had nursed them, where their story had truly begun. It was poetic, symbolic, and strategically sound. Plus, he'd seen it first. Remus, however, preferred the Aventine Hill. It offered better views of the surrounding countryside, more space for expansion, and excellent defensive positions. Also, and this was important, it was his idea. To most people, this would have been a minor disagreement, easily resolved through compromise or adult conversation. But Romulus and Remus were not most people. They were divinely stubborn, violently competitive, and absolutely convinced that every decision they made was a matter of cosmic significance. So instead of talking it out like rational adults, they decided to consult the gods, because nothing resolves sibling rivalry like involving supernatural beings with their own agendas. The method they chose was augury, the ancient Roman practice of divining the will of the gods by observing the flight patterns of birds. It was considered one of the most reliable forms of prophecy, assuming you could find birds willing to cooperate and interpret their behaviour correctly. The twins positioned themselves on their respective hills and began their vigil. The plan was simple. Whoever saw the most birds would be chosen by the gods to lead the new city. It was democracy by avian committee, with destiny hanging in the balance. Remus, perched on the Aventine Hill, was the first to spot birds. 6 vultures circled overhead, their wings cutting through the morning air in what he interpreted as a clear sign of divine approval. He sent word to his brother. The gods had spoken, and they'd chosen him to lead the new settlement. But Romulus, who had been watching the skies with the intensity of a man whose entire future depended on bird behaviour, wasn't ready to concede defeat. He continued his vigil, and just as Remus's messengers were approaching, 12 vultures appeared over the Palatine Hill. 12 vultures, twice as many as his brother had seen. The numerical superiority was undeniable, and Romulus immediately declared victory. The gods, he announced, had clearly chosen him to lead the new city. The evidence was literally soaring overhead. But Remus had a different interpretation. He'd seen his birds first, which meant the gods had spoken to him first. The timing, he argued, was more important than the numbers. Priority trumped quantity in divine communication. It was exactly the sort of argument that could have been resolved by a coin flip, if coins had been invented yet. Instead, it became a theological debate, with potentially violent consequences. Both brothers were absolutely certain that they were right. and both were absolutely unwilling to back down. The followers of each brother began to choose sides. Some supported Romulus's numerical advantage, others backed Remus's priority claim. The unified group that had set out to found a city was rapidly dividing into two factions, each convinced that their leader was the chosen one. And so, in a decision that would have made their wolf mother proud, the twins decided to settle the dispute in the most Roman way possible. They would each build their own city, and let the gods decide which one deserved to survive. It was exactly the sort of solution that sounds reasonable until you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But thinking things through had never been the strong suit of men raised by predators. The competition began immediately. Romulus started construction on the Palatine Hill, laying out the boundaries of his settlement with all the precision of a divinely inspired urban planner. He called his city Rome after himself, because subtlety was for people who hadn't been personally nursed by wolves. Remus, meanwhile, began building his own settlement on the Aventine Hill. He called it Remuria, demonstrating that the twins' approach to naming cities was about as creative as their approach to conflict resolution. Both cities were being built within sight of each other, which meant that every decision became a matter of comparison and competition. If Romulus built walls 10 feet high, Remus built them 12 feet high. If Remus constructed a temple, Romulus built a bigger one. It was urban planning as performance art, with each brother trying to prove that his city was more worthy of divine favour. The competition might have continued indefinitely, with both cities growing larger and more elaborate as the twins tried to outdo each other, but tensions were rising, and the followers of each brother were beginning to look at their rivals with the kind of suspicion that tends to end in bloodshed. Something had to give. The question was whether it would be pride, walls, or brothers. The answer, as it turned out, was all three. The twin cities of Rome and Remuria rose from the Italian hills like monuments to sibling rivalry. Each day brought new construction, new innovations, and new opportunities for the brothers to demonstrate their superiority to each other. It was urban development as psychological warfare, with every brick laid being a statement of divine favour and architectural supremacy. Romulus, working on the Palatine Hill, had thrown himself into city building with the obsessive intensity of a man who believed his entire identity depended on the outcome. He designed wide streets, impressive temples, and most importantly, a defensive wall that would protect his citizens from any threats that might arise. The wall was his masterpiece, thick, tall, and constructed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested he was building for eternity. The wall was also, as it turned out, a source of considerable pride. Romulus had personally overseen every aspect of its construction, from the foundation stones to the guard towers. It represented everything he wanted his city to be: strong, permanent, and absolutely impregnable. It was the physical manifestation of his divine destiny, carved in stone and mortar. Remus, meanwhile, was taking a more, let's call it, critical approach to his brother's architectural achievements. From his position on the Aventine Hill, he had an excellent view of Romulus's construction project, and he was not impressed. The wall, in his professional opinion, was a joke. It was too low, too thin, and too obviously the work of someone who had learned military engineering from wolves. Now, a mature person might have expressed these concerns through diplomatic channels, perhaps by sending a polite message suggesting improvements. But Remus was not a mature person. He was a divinely stubborn young man who had spent his entire life believing that his opinions were matters of cosmic significance. So instead of offering constructive criticism, Remus decided to provide a practical demonstration of his brother's wall's inadequacies. He walked over to the Palatine Hill, took a running start, and jumped over the wall. Just like that. One quick hop, and he was standing in the middle of Rome, grinning at the guards who were supposed to keep invaders out. "Some wall," he announced to anyone within earshot. "I've seen higher fences around chicken coops." The insult was devastating, and it was made worse by the fact that it was delivered in front of Romulus's followers. Nothing undermines a leader's authority quite like having his defensive fortifications treated as a minor inconvenience by his own brother. But Romulus, to his credit, maintained his composure. He walked over to where Remus was standing, looked his brother in the eye, and delivered a warning that was both reasonable and ominous. "Don't do that again." It was the kind of warning that a wise person would have heeded. Romulus was not known for his patience, and he was surrounded by armed followers who took threats to their leader's dignity very seriously. The smart play would have been to apologize, maybe make a joke about it, and find a different way to express architectural criticism. But Remus had never been accused of being wise. He was proud, impulsive, and absolutely convinced that his brother's threats were empty bluster. So the next day he did it again. He jumped over the wall, made another joke about its height, and strolled back to the Aventine Hill like he was taking a casual walk through a park. The pattern continued for days. Every morning, Remus would arrive at the wall, leap over it with theatrical flair, make some cutting remark about its construction, and then return to his own city. It became a daily humiliation for Romulus, performed in front of an audience that was beginning to question whether their leader was strong enough to protect them. The followers of Romulus were becoming increasingly agitated. They'd signed up to build a great city under a divinely chosen leader, not to watch their king be mocked by his brother on a daily basis. Some began to mutter about the need for action, about the importance of defending their leader's honor, about the precedent being set when walls were treated as suggestions rather than barriers. Romulus, meanwhile, was caught between his love for his brother and his responsibility to his followers. Every day that Remus jumped the wall was another day that his authority was undermined, another day that his divine mandate was questioned. He was being forced to choose between family loyalty and political survival, and the choice was tearing him apart. The breaking point came on a morning that had started like any other. Remus arrived at the wall, took his usual running start, and prepared to make his daily leap. But this time Romulus was waiting for him on the other side, along with several of his most trusted followers. "I warned you," Romulus said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that makes smart people start backing away slowly. But Remus, who had apparently mistaken his brother's patience for weakness, laughed. "And I told you the wall was too low. Maybe if you'd built it properly, this wouldn't be a problem." It was the wrong thing to say, it was the wrong time to say it, and it was definitely the wrong audience to say it to. What happened next was so quick that witnesses would later disagree about the details. Some said Romulus drew his sword and struck his brother down in a fit of rage. Others claimed that one of his followers acted without orders, killing Remus to defend their leader's honor. A few insisted that the gods themselves struck down the younger twin for his hubris. But the result was the same. Remus lay dead beside the wall he had mocked, his blood seeping into the soil of the city he would never live to see completed. The competition between the brothers was over, and there was only one winner. Romulus stood over his brother's body, and for a moment, the divine certainty that had driven him his entire life seemed to waver. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. They were supposed to build something great together, to fulfill their destiny as the twin sons of Mars. Instead, he was standing over his brother's corpse, wondering how jumping over a wall had led to fratricide. But the moment of doubt passed quickly. Romulus was, above all else, a practical man. Remus was dead, and no amount of regret would bring him back. The city still needed to be built, the people still needed to be led, and destiny still needed to be fulfilled. If it could only be done by one brother instead of two, then so be it. He turned to his followers, who were staring at him with a mixture of horror and awe. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying across the construction site. "The walls of Rome are sacred. Anyone who treats them with disrespect will face the same fate." It was a harsh lesson, but it was also an effective one. No one would ever jump over the walls of Rome again. The city's first law had been written in blood, and its first king had learned that sometimes leadership requires making choices that leave you standing alone. Romulus ordered his brother's body to be buried with full honors, and work on the city continued. But something had changed. The twin cities had become a single city, and the brothers who had been raised by wolves had become a single, solitary king. Rome was born in that moment, not from the divine intervention of gods, or the careful planning of architects, but from the simple, brutal fact that sometimes, when two people want the same thing, only one of them can have it. And Romulus, standing alone on the Palatine Hill, realized that being chosen by the gods was a lonelier business than he'd expected. With his brother safely buried and his authority unquestionably established, Romulus threw himself into the business of city building with the manic enthusiasm of a man who had just discovered that fratricide was an effective form of urban planning. Rome, no longer competing with the now defunct Remuria, could finally reach its full potential as a monument to divine favour and architectural ambition. The city grew rapidly under Romulus's leadership. He laid out forums for commerce, temples for worship, and administrative buildings for the complex business of governing a growing population. He established laws, created institutions, and generally behaved like someone who had read a handbook on how to build a civilization, assuming such handbooks existed and were written by people who had been raised by wolves. The population of Rome swelled as word spread about the new city where a man could make his fortune, find his destiny, or at least get a fresh start away from whatever crimes he'd committed elsewhere. Romulus had adopted an immigration policy that was both generous and practical. Anyone who wanted to live in Rome was welcome, regardless of their background, their past, or their relationship with the laws of other cities. This policy attracted exactly the sort of people you'd expect: runaway slaves, escaped criminals, political refugees, and ambitious young men who saw opportunity in the chaos of a brand new civilization. It was like a startup company crossed with a witness protection program, and it created a citizenry that was diverse, motivated, and absolutely loyal to the king, who had given them a second chance. But Rome's rapid growth had created an unexpected problem, one that would test Romulus's leadership in ways that slaying his brother had not. The city was thriving, the economy was booming, and the future looked bright. There was just one tiny issue: Rome was running out of women. The problem was mathematical. Most of the immigrants to Rome were men, young, single, ambitious men who had come to the city to make their fortunes. But they'd also come hoping to start families, and families, as it turned out, required women. The neighbouring cities, however, were not particularly interested in sending their daughters to marry the criminals and refugees who made up Rome's population. Romulus, who had successfully solved the problem of sibling rivalry through the application of sharp objects, decided to tackle the woman shortage with the same direct approach that had served him so well in the past. If the neighbouring cities wouldn't voluntarily provide wives for his citizens, then he would simply have to convince them to be more generous. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its execution. He would invite all the neighbouring tribes to a great festival in honour of Neptune, complete with games, contests, and entertainment. It would be a celebration of friendship and cooperation, a chance for the new city of Rome to demonstrate its hospitality to its neighbours. And in the spirit of inclusivity, everyone was invited, including, and this was crucial, their unmarried daughters. The festival was planned with the kind of attention to detail that had made Rome's walls the envy of the region. There would be athletic competitions, theatrical performances, and enough food and wine to ensure that everyone had a good time. It would be the social event of the season, the sort of gathering that people would talk about for years to come. And indeed, they would talk about it for years to come, though probably not in the way Romulus intended. The day of the festival arrived, and the response was everything Romulus had hoped for. Representatives from the Sabine tribe, the Canaans, the Antemnids, and dozens of other neighbouring communities descended on Rome, bringing with them their families, their unmarried daughters, and their complete lack of suspicion about their host's intentions. The festival began exactly as advertised. There were races, wrestling matches, and demonstrations of martial skill. The wine flowed freely, the food was abundant, and the atmosphere was festive. The visitors were impressed by Rome's organisation, charmed by its hospitality, and completely unprepared for what came next. At a pre-arranged signal, accounts vary, but most suggest it was Romulus adjusting his cloak, the Romans sprang into action. But instead of continuing the athletic competitions, they began systematically kidnapping every unmarried woman at the festival. It was like a coordinated military operation, executed with the precision of a well-trained army and the moral flexibility of pirates. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The male visitors, who had come to enjoy a peaceful festival, suddenly found themselves in the middle of what could only be described as a mass abduction. Some fought back, others fled, and a few stood frozen in shock at the audacity of what they were witnessing. But the Romans were prepared for resistance. They had planned this operation carefully, and they executed it with the kind of efficiency that would have made their descendants proud. Within minutes, every unmarried woman at the festival had been claimed by a Roman citizen, and the visitors were being politely but firmly escorted to the city gates. The women themselves, understandably, were less than thrilled with these developments. They had come to Rome expecting entertainment and diplomacy, not marriage proposals delivered at sword point. But Romulus, who had clearly given some thought to the public relations aspect of mass kidnapping, was prepared with a speech. He addressed the captured women with the kind of earnest sincerity that suggested he genuinely believed he was doing them a favour. They shouldn't think of this as an abduction, he explained, but as an opportunity. Rome was a great city with a bright future, and they were being offered the chance to become the founding mothers of a new civilization. Their children would be citizens of the most powerful city in Italy, and they would be honoured as the women who had made that civilization possible. It was exactly the sort of speech that might have been inspiring if it hadn't been delivered to a group of women who had been kidnapped during what they'd thought was a religious festival. But Romulus was nothing if not persistent. He assured the women that they would be treated with respect, that their marriages would be legal and binding, and that they would find happiness in their new lives as Roman wives. He even promised that their husbands would be chosen carefully, matched to their personalities and preferences. The women, being practical people, realized that they had limited options. They could accept their situation and try to make the best of it, or they could resist and face the consequences. Most chose the former, though whether this was due to Romulus's persuasive speaking or the presence of armed guards is a matter of historical debate. And so Rome solved its woman shortage in the most Roman way possible, through a combination of careful planning, overwhelming force, and the kind of diplomatic innovation that would have made Machiavelli weep with admiration. The immediate problem was solved, but the long-term consequences were about to begin, because the fathers, brothers, and former suitors of the kidnapped women were not the sort of people who would accept this situation quietly. They were already gathering their armies, sharpening their weapons, and planning the kind of revenge that would make the sack of Troy look like a minor disagreement. Romulus had solved one problem and created a dozen others, but he was confident that Rome could handle whatever came next. After all, he was a man who had been raised by wolves, chosen by the gods, and blessed with the kind of divine favour that made impossible things seem routine. He was about to discover that divine favour, while useful, was not the same thing as a good marriage counsellor. The kidnapping of the Sabine women had, as you might expect, some rather predictable consequences. The neighbouring tribes were not particularly amused by Romulus's creative solution to Rome's demographic problems, and they expressed their displeasure in the traditional manner, by gathering large armies and marching on Rome with the intention of burning it to the ground. But here's where the story takes one of those turns that makes ancient history so delightfully absurd. Because while the men were busy planning their revenge, the kidnapped women were settling into their new lives with the kind of pragmatic adaptability that would become a hallmark of Roman civilization. The women had been treated well, as Romulus had promised. Their marriages were legal, their husbands were respectful, and their children were already being hailed as the future of Rome. When their male relatives arrived with armies to rescue them, many of the women found themselves in the awkward position of not particularly wanting to be rescued. The climactic battle between the Romans and the Sabines was shaping up to be the kind of epic confrontation that poets would sing about for generations. But just as the two armies were about to clash, the women threw themselves between the warring forces and delivered what might be history's most effective peace speech. "Stop," they said, in essence. "We are your daughters and sisters, but we are also wives and mothers now. If you fight, you will be fighting our husbands, and our children will be orphans, regardless of who wins. We don't want to be rescued from lives we've chosen to embrace." It was exactly the sort of emotional appeal that turns a straightforward military conflict into a complicated family drama. The Sabine warriors, who had come to Rome prepared to die for their honour, found themselves being lectured by their daughters about the importance of family harmony. And amazingly, it worked. The Romans and Sabines agreed to merge their communities, creating a single people under joint leadership. Romulus would remain king of Rome, but he would share power with Titus Tatius, the Sabine leader. The kidnapping that had started as a diplomatic disaster ended as a model of international cooperation. Rome had doubled its population, gained valuable allies, and solved its woman shortage all in one stroke. It was the kind of outcome that suggested divine intervention, incredible luck, or both. So under this new arrangement, Rome prospered like never before. The combined Roman-Sabine population brought together the best of both cultures, creating a society that was both militaristic and civilized, aggressive and diplomatic. The city expanded, the economy grew, and the joint rule of Romulus and Titus Tatius seemed to be working remarkably well. But success, as Romulus was about to discover, came with its own challenges. The power-sharing arrangement that had seemed so reasonable in the aftermath of the Sabine crisis began to feel increasingly restrictive. Romulus, who had grown accustomed to making decisions with divine certainty, found himself having to consult with Titus Tatius on every major issue. The situation became more complicated when Titus Tatius died in a skirmish with a neighbouring tribe, leaving Romulus as the sole ruler once again. But by then, the citizens of Rome had grown accustomed to the checks and balances of shared leadership. They wanted more say in important decisions, more transparency in government, and generally more of the things that make absolute monarchy inconvenient. Romulus, who had briefly enjoyed the constraints of joint rule, found himself increasingly at odds with his own people. The Senate, which he had created to advise him, began offering advice he didn't want to hear. The citizens, who had once hung on his every word, began to grumble about his increasingly autocratic style. The situation came to a head during a meeting of the Senate, when Romulus announced a series of new laws that would have concentrated even more power in his hands. The senators listened politely, then informed him that they would not support the changes. For the first time in his life, Romulus faced organized opposition from his own people. The confrontation that followed was heated but civilized. Romulus argued that his divine parentage gave him the right to rule as he saw fit. The senators countered that the gods had given them wisdom precisely so they could advise their king when he was making mistakes. It was exactly the sort of constitutional crisis that would have benefited from a written constitution, if anyone had thought to write one. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but fate decided to intervene in the most Roman way possible, through supernatural weather phenomena and political conspiracy. On a day when the Senate was meeting to discuss the constitutional crisis, a sudden storm arose. Thunder crashed, lightning split the sky, and the very air seemed to crackle with divine energy. In the midst of this supernatural chaos, Romulus simply disappeared. One moment he was standing in the Senate House, arguing with his advisors about the nature of divine kingship. The next moment, he was gone, leaving behind only his royal robes and a room full of very confused senators. The official story, as reported by those who were present, was that Romulus had been taken up to heaven by his divine father, Mars. The storm, they claimed, had been a chariot sent by the gods to carry their son home. It was a fitting end for a man who had been born of divine parentage and raised by wolves, a return to the supernatural realm from which he had come. But not everyone was convinced by this explanation. Some of the senators, when they thought no one was listening, suggested that the storm had been awfully convenient. Others pointed out that political opposition had a way of disappearing in ancient Rome, and that divine intervention was a remarkably tidy solution to a messy constitutional crisis. The truth, as is often the case with ancient history, depends on who you ask and how much you trust their motives. But the result was the same. Romulus was gone, and Rome needed a new form of government. The senators, who had been struggling with their king's authoritarian tendencies, found themselves in the unexpected position of having to choose his successor. They could have selected another king, but they'd had enough experience with absolute monarchy to know its limitations. Instead, they created something new, a republic, where power would be shared among elected officials and important decisions would be made collectively. It was a radical experiment in government, inspired partly by political philosophy and partly by the desire to never again have to deal with a king who thought his divine parentage gave him the right to ignore everyone else's opinions. And so ended the story of Romulus, the wolf-raised prince who became the founder of Rome. He had started life as an abandoned infant, survived through the intervention of wild animals, discovered his royal heritage, murdered his brother, built a great city, kidnapped his citizens' wives, and finally vanished in a supernatural storm that may or may not have been arranged by frustrated senators. It was exactly the sort of career trajectory that could only happen in ancient Rome, where the line between history and mythology was more of a suggestion than a rule. Rome itself continued to grow and prosper, eventually becoming the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The city that had begun as a competition between brothers became the foundation of Western civilization, and the laws that had first been written in blood became the basis for legal systems that endure to this day. But all of that was still in the future. For now, Rome was simply a city with a remarkable origin story, a complex government, and a population that was learning to live with the fact that their founder had been the sort of person who solved problems by hitting them with sharp objects. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most Roman thing of all. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.